Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so being relatively new to this community, it seemed to me there were two things that I could talk about. One of which is to look at what end-user programming can tell us from a usability perspective about how to design our tools, how to improve our tools. And then the second is the thing which is essentially the more theoretic research agenda of what can an attitude of end-user programming tell us about living systems? If we apply this as a conceptual framework, what could we learn? Now, it seems to me that throughout this, there's been quite a bit of talk about usability, some of which has been, in some cases, a bit of a counsel of despair. People have been finding it difficult to improve the usability of their tools. It's been a frustrating experience for them. So, consequently, I'll probably stress slightly more the first half than the second half than I would have expected. So this is a discussion of how can we use the usability framework tools that we have designed to help build scientific tools that don't exhibit the problems we heard about earlier of 1,000 different users tell us 1,000 different things. So, firstly, I'll take a brief look at what end-user programming is as a topic. Then how can we use it to support scientists, and then conclude with the theoretical contributions. So, if we look at the history of human-computer interaction and how it's been believed we should improve the usability of computer-based systems, it has generally taken an attitude of migrating from the 1960s approach, where everyone who used a computer was a programmer by necessity, to the approach now called direct manipulation. So this is, you grab objects, you do stuff to the objects, literally, so you move icons around one at a time, you type and get an instant response. And mainstream usability has been migrating computers from here to here. And there are very good cognitive reasons for doing this. The theories behind direct manipulation are believed to be inspired by kind of fundamental cognition, what humans find it easy to do. However, there is a trade-off in power and flexibility when we do this. So the actions on objects paradigm, whilst it's proved to be useful for doing things like writing Microsoft Word, leads us to difficulties when it simply isn't possible to do the actions on the objects one at a time. So there might be a couple of cases where this might be true. The first is when we want to provide actions on a lot of objects all at once. We've been hearing about petabyte data sets. You're not going to be dragging those one node at a time. The second thing that we might want to do, in line with the talk we just heard, is when we're providing functionality that will be used when I'm not here. So we don't want a kind of infinite army of gnomes saying, oh, I've got this request, I'll drag this piece of text here. We want to provide a functional behavior that will be used at our request. These are, to some degree, the kind of things which programming is made up of as a conceptual activity. And they're very familiar operations to professional programmers. So, end-user programming situates itself as an agenda by saying, well, we've got a lot of usability benefits out of direct manipulation, but in exchange, we've lost a lot of power and flexibility. We've kind of created two classes of user, the user who can program and the user who can't. This is unfortunate. It's probably not necessary. We can probably improve certain types of tools by attempting to give end users the power they would get by being able to program back again. And essentially, one of the arguments I'm going to make here is that the reason we are having difficulty building usable scientific tools is because scientific tools are fundamentally programming. There is nothing we can do to escape this. So if we consider them as direct manipulation tools, suddenly none of our techniques seem to work. And it's because they're designed to solve a different type of problem. So the first thing to note is that end users can program. There is nothing to say that somebody who doesn't have a degree in computer science has difficulty programming. The numbers are difficult to estimate because the various complexities, but we have 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more people who write software in Excel in the USA than we do who are classified professional programmers. So we have a few million users using this. Most of them will never have read a manual, and yet they can do. So this is good news. Similarly, the PowerPoint animation functions. You can make a square migrate to another square along a path when I click a button without having to do the operations one at a time. This is an example of programming in our world. The programming language is here. Okay, it looks a bit different to C#, but some of the conceptual activities are still the same. And okay, so PowerPoint's functions get abused, but there is no cognitive barrier preventing people being able to do this. And likewise, I believe one of the talks later is about mashups. This is Yahoo's tool for building mashups, rapidly combining functionality from various different websites. And again, we have end users, enthusiasts creating systems like this, and it seems reasonably usable. And it's not even new. So this is a visual programming language from the 80s that founded some of the research in this area. It's known as LabVIEW. And you would see professionals, not computer scientists, engaging in building this kind of program, sharing them with each other, and using them to diagnose problems. And if you follow this through, you can see similar things to this appearing in things like MATLAB's Simulink. So the point of this is that end users can program. There is nothing fundamental stopping them. We just need to give them the right tools and understand what the right problem is. Okay, so the next question might be then, well, if everyone can do this, why does it need a name? The point I'm trying to make here is that by calling it end-user programming, I'm not just attempting to engage in some form of academic land grab. It's that there is a fundamental recognition that the cognitive activities a programmer is going through is different to the cognitive activities of operations on objects. It's a more abstract task by definition. And because it's a more abstract task, a lot of our techniques that were designed to remove abstractions from systems in order to make them easier break down. So if we take this, which is part of the security configuration interface of Windows, if we look at this through the standard lens of a direct manipulation user interface approach, it looks reasonably good. So it has rapid feedback, it has operations on objects. However, if we look at this through the lens of a programming activity, it has severe problems. So it has, for reasons that I'm not going to go into particularly much, it has very strong hidden dependencies. I can create cycles which I can't see here. These cycles have important usability properties. It has poor provisionality. I can't make approximate marks and then tidy them up later. We know this is important for the way programmers work. It has poor progressive evaluation. If I'm trying to complete a large, complex task, then I can't do it in little bits and understand how far I'm getting through the problem. So we have two issues. The standard tools that we've been trying to use run into all sorts of problems, predicting things that should be good, when the tools, if we look at it like a programming language, predict problems. And indeed, in user studies, we see the problems occurring. So, by understanding that something is programming, the idea is we can make it substantially more, we can apply different techniques which help the usability in different ways. So, 3 techniques, cognitive dimensions of notations, which is the most accepted, one I'll be giving a 2-minute overview of. The attention investment framework, which is a discussion of when people begin programming and when they choose to switch from one cognitive behavior to another, and how to support them during that switch. And one in progress, which is the user experience of intentional information. So how do people perceive the intention behind programs? That won't be covered at all. So, end user programming for life scientists. What we did is, if we take this kind of thing, which is the kind of tool we are building, which is a description of a regulatory network model in this case in a custom C# application. Then we use the analytical tools of end-user programming. We consider this to be a behavior-like programming, apply them, and compare, in this case, the version before the improvement and the version after the improvement. Slightly biased description. It was an improvement. We get good provisional results by applying these tools. So the point here is that end-user programming techniques have been shown to be relevant to improving the usability of the tools we are building. So, cognitive dimensions. This is probably slightly mistargeted for this audience. The idea is that we consider a user interface as an environment. So if you look at Word, the text in the middle of it, the document, is the notation. The things surrounding it are the environment. And we consider an activity of these along various dimensions, which we know have cognitive properties. So one of which is a question of how diffuse the information is. So for a long time, it seemed that visual programming languages should solve all of our problems. I mean, you just connect stuff together and it works. But yet, textual programming languages, like we saw, are still dominant as the main way of programming. The argument for why this might be the case, perhaps, might be that visual programming languages are far more diffuse to express the same thing. So if we have a complex problem, we need a lot more space. That means it becomes difficult to see connections across things, etc. This causes problems. We have viscosity. So if I perform one change in my LabVIEW diagram, suddenly I have to change everything that was connected to it, everything that was laid out around it. This is a standard problem. How many abstractions are there within the system that I have to learn, etc., etc. So this gives us a way of talking about the various usability properties of a programming language and how we can structure the programming language to support those properties or to choose trade-offs between them. And we end up with analytical results that look like this, where, to a first approximation, the volume of red shows a concentration of serious problem in that area. So we should be concentrating usability resource on these issues. And okay, they may make some bits slightly worse, but we can afford that. That will result in an overall improvement to the usability of the tool we are building. So this is an argument that essentially, if you're going to use one of these tools, cognitive dimensions may be one of your best shots at improving the usability of it. Unfortunately, the typical training time for it, we've managed to get it down to about 3 hours worth of training plus a small demo. So I'm not going to be able to kind of explain how to do it here and now. But this is perhaps an area that might help us get out of the problems that we've been talking about throughout this conference. The tool is showing the cognitive dimensions are showing adoption. It's been successful in scientific tools. Microsoft use it very heavily in improving the usability of APIs. It's shown the ability to talk sensibly about security usability. It's shown improvements to spreadsheet design. Okay, so there's some value here. If we take that, and if we take this attitude that we're talking about of what does end-user programming mean for life scientists, and take it a bit further. So Jasmine Fisher's work, who's the collaborator on this paper, has been saying what happens if we consider biological processes like C. elegans to actually be instantiations of computational processes. Then what we can do is have an interaction between a computer model of something and the biological process. So we build a model, we compare predictions from the model to actual real wet lab data, and use this to either suggest new experiments that we might do, so discovering exciting new timing properties of living systems has been one of these things. Or we may use it to observe that the model needs adjusting, and this provides new theoretical understanding. So this technique of looking at life in this way has given us a number of successes. So we have we've experimentally verified some changes in the regulatory models that otherwise might have been too expensive to do by just experimental approaches. So looking at one of these refinement pathways takes a lot of hours in the lab. By looking at it in a software lab first, we can more appropriately spend this expensive lab time. we have, Jasmine and her collaborators have proposed new concurrency models to better reflect what we believe is happening inside biological processes. And formal methods have been used for what we believe is a relatively novel technique of proving that models of data, models of biological systems, verify against data that's been experimentally taken. So this gives us some sense of completeness and assurance in the totality of the model, as opposed to single point verifications along the way. So this seems very promising. There are a number of challenges, one of which is that computer systems don't tolerate ambiguity very well. There is a lot of ambiguity in regulatory networks to do with their timing behavior. It's unclear in many cases how to do practical experiments that can obtain the kind of timing data we would need in order to understand what those arcs mean. So that's one thing that's difficult with the biology. A thing that's difficult with the computing is that the computational models, programming languages as we know them today, are generally designed for doing useful things, making computers do stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean they have particularly good fit to biological processes. So, we are in need of new abstractions. The abstraction processes that we have today of saying, here's this chunk of stuff, I'm going to attempt to build a black box around it and pretend I don't need to look inside it, don't really work in terms of biological systems. If you look in more detail, they tend to break down. They tend to break down through complex context interactions, etc. So we need abstractions where we can look inside the abstraction when we want to, essentially a scalable level of detail as opposed to a staircasing level of detail. And in studies of professional programmers, we see that abstraction has fairly severe problem in actual programming computers as well in using biology. So if we could get a more sensible way of talking about what abstraction is in computing, we would improve both sides of this balance. Then there is the more fundamental question of what does it actually mean to consider life to be a program? We understand programs with a goal in mind. We understand them to change some behavior. It's not clear to me that that is what would be desired in understanding life as a program. So, we have also seen, I was very happy to see Barker being quoted earlier today, one of his contributions with Jeff Starr to the philosophy of knowledge is understanding that classification systems don't merely observe the world, they change the world. So the International Classification of Disease is a complex ontology for representing how people got ill, how they died, and using this for forming government statistics. So it needs the consistency that we've heard about frequently here. This also means that different types of information got recorded. So it changed our understanding of, for example, the way heart disease gets recorded in the Far East. It has a social stigma attached to it. So if it's reported only to the government, if you get separate reporting to the family and to the government, you tend to get different answers than if you get single reporting to both. So when we create this abstraction, the way in which those abstractions are going to be used has a substantial effect on what gets understood out of the end of the system. So if we are designing abstractions with which to do science, we should be careful about what we want to understand and how we're going to shape our knowledge afterwards. So how to introduce that into the process of building abstractions that are also computationally tractable is one of the kind of key research areas we're looking at. And ultimately, adoption of these tools and therefore impact into the scientific community is not purely a technical matter. We need to, once we've decided to some degree what questions are interesting and how we're going to produce answers to those questions, it's important to understand whether the community also thinks those questions are interesting. Fundamentally, if they don't, the tool will not gain adoption. No sensible new knowledge or understanding will be generated. So, what I have said, usability is crucial to adoption. I don't think that there's very much need to go on talking about that, given previous speakers. The standard techniques for improving direct manipulation systems are necessary, but they're not sufficient for dealing with problems where fundamentally the cognitive activity is programming. This is not as bad as it seems to be. There are end-user programming techniques used to understand how to design programming languages to improve their usability, how to design complex systems to improve their usability for end users with low technical training in programming, for example. There are techniques out there that can help. Executable biology takes the process of saying, what happens if we consider living systems to be programs? It's essentially a pragmatic form of computationalism. This results in deep challenges, such as, what is it we are trying to understand? How can we shape the design of the programming languages to give us that understanding we seek? And this process of designing new abstractions to support that goal hopefully will help both computational biology and computer science programming activities in the wild, so to speak. So, hopefully accelerating discovery by providing new ways of thinking about biological systems. Time for questions, or shall I wrap up?
Yeah, so we have 3 minutes for questions. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please walk to the microphone.
So given the criticism of visual programming language by people like Bonnie Nardi and Brad Myers, why did you choose to use a visual programming language for your investigation and not a more controlled language?
So the criticism by Brad Myers, for example, which I know more about, is not a blanket criticism. What he's reacting to is the kind of the euphoria of visual programming, the belief that it will solve everything. So indeed, his student, Andy Coe, is one of the leaders in visual programming languages, the field. So we chose to use a visual programming language because it provides things like the relatively gentle slope of how you can learn the abstractions throughout the process, which textual languages struggle to provide. So its usability properties align to the kind of problem we're solving. What I think Brad and Bonnie were saying is they don't solve every problem for free, and certainly I agree.
This is a very interesting talk. In general, in programming, people are also talking about programming the large and programming the small. And in my belief, visual programming is really more fall into the paradigm of programming the large. Because programming the small essentially is like C# or Java, focus on the functionality. On the other hand, programming the large, assuming each building block are already developer using traditional language and focus on the coordination or communication between that language. So can you comment on the relationship between these and the usability or the programming paradigm you're talking about?
So that's a very interesting question. It's not entirely clear to me how well the parallel from programming in the large to biological systems works.
For example, right now the workflow community, in particular scientific workflow, most of the language right now are actually visual.
Sure.
And
yes.
the programming in large.
Yes, I understand. To some degree, our biological systems look like programming in the large, in the sense of they are single blocks encompassing quite a lot of behavior within the block, and the behavior is at a fairly abstract level of description. And what we're interested in doing to some degree is understanding the emergent effects of interactions between them. So to some extent, that looks like the kind of thing we do with workflow programming in the large. On the other hand, part of the need for translucent abstractions is that only looking at things in this large level of granularity and detail proves insufficient at times. So we need the ability to take apart these large blocks and move towards perhaps more textual representations. So far, we haven't done so badly with basically grid-based representations, which underlie the abstract blocks you would have seen on the screen. So the distinction is interesting. And becomes particularly interesting when you look at things like the techniques that, for example, Microsoft or Google would use to manage the running of a large compute cluster where everything starts to behave non-deterministically and you need to overlay controls over the top. That has a lot of correspondences to the kind of problem we try and solve in executable biology. And I think it's fair to say that we don't really know the usability properties of the languages we need to support that yet. So that's kind of ongoing work.
So we'll have last question. Please make it quick.
Do you or how do you distinguish between simulation of, say, cellular biochemistry and executable programming?
That's a very good question. Jasmine, who runs the Executable Biology group, views this as a very important distinction, that one requires, essentially, executable biology carries to some degree a commitment to how it should be executed within the program itself, whereas simulations, how it should be executed is independent. I'm less inclined to view this as a kind of important distinction and would see all programming as a some part simulation, some part execution, really dependent on kind of how much intention would we ascribe to the things. So if we're talking about arcs upregulating and downregulating, that's a kind of intentional mode of description, certainly a kind of agentic mode of description. That's where I would view the difference be. So being essentially in the kind of language that we would use to describe what's going on if we were talking to another person about it.